Welcome back, everyone, to Frontlines and Faultlines with Mike Kelly. Great to have you back. And this week, what we're going to be doing is a deep dive on the Russian involvement in Africa and the Middle East. I feel it's important that we round out the strategic understanding of how we approach and deal with Russia in this era of the Putin regime and what's driving them, how they're executing their global geopolitical strategies, and what the implications are for us, and how can we confront this style of operation, which is so devoid of any kind of moral or democratic underpinning. And it is incredibly important for us to understand it. So in this conversation, what I'll be running through is, where Russian foreign policy is going at the moment, what their involvement has been in Africa and the Middle East, and we'll be looking at case studies in both of those regions that really bring home and join the dots on what the Russian approach is and what impact it's having, but also the obviously very close intertwining of this dynamic with those two regions, Africa and the Middle East, so closely associated with the driving motivators for Russia and the effects of what their interference has. And now, in this modern context, how they're actually coordinating those efforts with Iran to a greater extent even than the past. So at the end of that, we'll be looking at, what has the international response been and where are we likely to see trends go and our ability to respond to those in the future. So when we talk about Russian foreign policy and we look at the context of this, we're looking at the Cold War foundation obviously set this global hemispheric dynamic, and the mindset from Russia hasn't really improved since that time under Putin. That's the world he was born into, the world that shaped him as his KGB background that we talked about earlier has set him up mentally to really be a part of, but also the strategies and tactics that were applied during that time things that he has recycled to his own advantage, but added to in the various technological and financial ways that are now available to him in the modern context. And so the issues around that transition out to the Russian Federation, which left all those fault lines in Russia that he was able to exploit, have also given him the tools with which to now get into the manipulation and internal interference that we're seeing in these regions today. And particularly the growth of the things that we'll be talking about of the private military corporations in Russia, the well-known one of the Wagner Group, which Prigozhin and Dmitry Utkin established, which has now changed its name to Africa Corps, but how those organizations operate and how they've evolved in this construct within the state platforms in Russia and the alliance dynamics that are feeding into that now with this, as my reference to the rectangular rat bags brings us back to China, North Korea, Iran and Russia. So this Putin factor has been the really important underpinning thing here. And so their military alliances that they've formed amongst those global autocratic powers have helped them to develop strategies and influence within Africa and the Middle East to shape the politics of those regions to match that autocratic framework. And we've surfaced in the past how the world has now rapidly moved to this position where 71% of the world's people live in autocracies. And so the messages and information warfare that are applied to their international dealings really underpin those mutual self-interests. And also when it comes to Russia's involvement in Africa and the Middle East, we're talking particularly about the centrality of the energy sector to this and energy security dynamics and concerns. On the one hand, particularly China's fixation on energy security, and then Russia's strategic role in energy security with their vast resources themselves, but also how their global company Gazprom works in this environment, and how that played out in Europe as well. And so how has this geopolitical influence worked so well, and what are the implications for countries and, a positive outcome for the African and Middle East peoples. What have we really abandoned our concern for true principles of democracy and economic prosperity for the average peoples of those regions? So the Russian aim to bolster their military relationships with allied nations and to enhance their defence capabilities has been a traditional platform for their engagement, particularly in the Middle East. In the nascent years of the Cold War, they used the opportunity to reach out to post-colonial and developing nations with the promise of economic assistance, and particularly with these autocracies, to give them their domestic security and military strength. So vast resources committed to Middle East nations in their confrontations with Israel through the period of the 60s and 70s and 80s and beyond. So that pre-Russian Federation context of the Soviet Union was already heavily engaged in the Middle East, particularly around that military and security relationship. Of course, the economic partnership has become so much more important for Russia these days because of the impacts of sanctions regimes, particularly post the invasion of Ukraine. And so that's become a vital part of how they've maneuvered strategically around sanctions regimes. And we'll see how that works in practice. So if we move to Russia's involvement in Africa firstly, and their military presence and alliances there, you've seen a bit of an evolution away from the formal military presence, which has been very prominent in the past, and we've seen situations where they've deployed their more sophisticated platforms in the relevant historical context with Russian military crewing of those assets, whether they be the more advanced aircraft or the SAM, surface-to-air missile batteries. These assets were closely guarded by Russia in terms of their advanced technologies at the times, and so they didn't actually really trust local personnel to operate them, and often they would staff them and crew them themselves. But now they've sort of moved away from a lot of the scale of the direct military presence. They still focus, though, in respect of that aspect of their relationships in the maintenance and protection and sustainment of strategic locations to do with their access to ports and their operation of air bases in particular. These are key pieces of the chess game for them in relation to how they manage that regional influence and interference. So ports, airports, really critical to that. Also critical to the regime around sanctions busting through the economic activities they conduct and that are facilitated by these private military corporations now. Weapons sales have also always been a big part of their economic interests in these regions. They sell things cheaper, and in the past, they were attempting to establish the reputation for having superior, or at least equivalent capabilities to the West in those platforms. A lot of the deficiencies of those platforms have been exposed from time to time, but the cost advantage there has been a significant factor in their ability to still continue to provide weaponry, and particularly too where there's no political constraint associated with that. So any autocracy, no matter how heinous, will be able to get hold of initially Soviet weapons and ordnance, but now Russian Federation weapons and ordnance, and also extensive involvement in training programs to build the capacity of military forces in Africa and the Middle East, often being transported to Russia, or establishment of training facilities in their geographic locations, sometimes in combination. For example, Iran and Russia collaborating in that respect. So when we talk about the trade and investment, the economic investments in Africa have really been only in terms of the logistics exploitation, and in the Middle East in providing technological capabilities to exploit local resources and sustainment and maintenance of the capability to exploit resources. So in particular, Iran is very dependent on Russia to maintain the viability of their oil industry through Gazprom, because they don't have really those skills and capabilities. And so sanctions that hit their ability to keep their oil refineries and exploitation infrastructure operating at full capacity were suffering until, they got more assistance and involvement from Russia. Political interference really recently has more been about distorting the dependence, or at least the resort by African governments, Middle East governments, to aid and development assistance from the West. The Russians have been particularly aiming at portraying any Western assistance as being an attempt by the old colonial powers to continue to exert control and influence, and encouraging a popular and political dynamic to reject any of those former colonial powers from having any influence or involvement in Africa or the Middle East, and that they are effectively part of the liberation framework for that, and it draws back on their tradition as part of the non-aligned movement and their ability to convince developing nations that they are in their corner, as opposed to the capitalist and exploitative and imperialist Western nations. And that's a narrative that's been quite successful and being built on now by the theme of saying what we want is a multipolar world, not a hegemonistic world. And that is a theme that is being tightly coordinated and collaborated on in relation to how China, Iran, North Korea, and Russia operate their information warfare strategies and techniques. So they'll get behind regime changes, military coups, etc. And once they do achieve those military coups and establishment of autocrats, it makes it then far easier for them to develop ties with the personnel, the players, the actors in those regimes through financial incentives. So a mutual interest. You're a dictator, you're going to become a very wealthy dictator through establishing your kleptocracy. And because you have been assisted and depend on the support that Russia provides you from a security point of view, militarily and domestic security and intelligence, then, and you may be able to draw on Russian technical ability to exploit resources, then, there's the mutual self-interest there. And for Russia, this is a vehicle for raping, pillaging, and plundering the economic resources of Africa with no constraint, no environmental constraint, least of all. But of course, this gives them the ability to draw on those resources without having any kind of local regulatory impact of taxes, etc., being placed upon them. So this mutual self-interest gives them access to, in particular, timber, diamonds, gold, and oil in these regions. And of course, the exploitation of the local populations through non-existent labour regulation, health, safety, etc., and child exploitation, and being able to then use their network of logistics infrastructure in ports and airports to facilitate that and as we highlighted, get around sanctions. So how this now operates under Putin is that you have, on the one hand, you've got their military intelligence structures with the GRU as their military intelligence organization, the SVR as their foreign intelligence service, and then you have the FSB as their domestic service. But in particular, in relation to Africa and the Middle East, you'll see the involvement of GRU and SVR. And so the other arm that we've talked about before of their government's ability to bypass or create plausible deniability for their more nefarious operations. You've got the financial resources of the oligarchs, and then these private military corporations that have been established or are money earners for these oligarchs as well. So it wasn't just the Wagner Group, which is now the Africa Corps, but a couple of others as well that are operating in Africa in particular. So, but the Wagner Corps really set the platform, set the techniques and procedures for how you go about this. So Prigozhin, in the way he established, working with Dmitry Utkin, established the Wagner Group, was that it would primarily be a way for exerting physical control through operatives who would conduct assassinations, etc., and then having that military capacity to then suppress any opposition or armed groups or even confrontations with other states. And so in the Middle East, the Wagner Corps was very active in Syria, but in Africa, it has been the dominant feature in a number of countries and works in collaboration, for example, with groups in Sudan like the RSF, and now sort of potentially changing sides in that respect in collaboration and coordination with Iran. But those private military corporations also engage in the information warfare side of things, because Prigozhin established the bot factories and the so-called Internet Research Agency in St. Petersburg to develop the techniques and technology for doing this, and then exploiting the ability to dominate the media and information scene in Africa to create the social license initially, at least, and then backed up by really heinous massacres, civilian rapes and intimidations and assassinations. There's no low bar for that group in how they will maintain their dominance or how they will achieve prominence through backing regimes. So this is how the network really operates, and it is creating the ability for Russia to circumvent international norms, international sanctions, international economic regimes, and measures of probative control. And you can see the scale of their activities to support all of this. So there you can see the active engagement of a lot of these private military corporations, and then areas where they're seeking to be more engaged or have partial engagement on the way. So the dynamics of this are multifaceted and proving quite successful for them in developing world countries where there are gaps, where there's areas to be exploited that the West has allowed them to seize the initiative on. So, and when we talk about specific locations in Africa, we mentioned Sudan, and of course what we're seeing in Sudan, the consequences of Russian involvement based on, of course, the existing fault lines of the RSF, which was effectively a formalization of the old Janjaweed Arab Muslim militia in Sudan, which had been guilty of conducting the genocide in Darfur a few years ago, and now repeating their genocidal activities, frankly. And really they operate off the incentives of their access to the gold industry in Sudan. The brother of the leader of the RSF was also the person running the gold mining company in Sudan. And so the relationship that Russia was able to build with the RSF gave them direct access to gold mining, and they were earning $1 billion a year from that gold mining. And those sorts of resources can then be transferred through ports that they operate, and port access that they operate in places like Tobruk, in which they're expanding, and now seeking to expand their porting capability and opportunities in Sudan through the main port there, the Sayed port. So that is a process that's underway at present time, and it also gives them some redundancy in the face of the threats they face to the capabilities they have that exist in Syria. So Sudan has been a close collaboration, and they've managed to find a way, because there was some issue of being at loggerheads with Iranian interests who were backing the Sudanese armed forces against the RSF. So in their closer world of collaboration with Iran, they've managed to work a way around that now, so that they are collaborating more closely with the Sudanese armed forces, because in the context of the conflict, it's been harder to actually access the gold resources in any event. So they're very fluid, flexible, agile, and adjusting who they support, how they support, and it's all very transactional and completely unlinked to basic standards and norms of human behavior or human rights principles, and really just all about exploitation. So you can see here some of those activities across Africa that relate to each other. They'll be exploiting resources in similar venues in Chad and Central African Republic, and of course in Mali and Nigeria as well. But those countries that are closely linked locally to their access to resources in Sudan really form a network, a logistics network that they try very hard to maintain in an efficient way. And Libya is becoming a real centerpiece of that logistic element of the exploitation process. And we'll come back to Libya in a minute. But you can see how central Sudan was to a lot of that as part of the network that they're building, at least in East Africa, and how that East African involvement also closely related to their other Middle East activities in Syria, which we'll come back to. So the company that I mentioned that the RSF operates, the Gennady company, they took possession and not only of the mining but the processing of gold tailings as well as gold exports, and so that ability to plug into that has been probably the jewel in the crown of what the Wagner Corporation was able to achieve economically in Africa, and the exploitation that's gone on there. They're, as I mentioned, very transactional in how they move from the RSF to Sudanese armed forces. But in April 2024, you saw negotiations really intensifying into the development of the Port of Sudan as one of the big elements of how they look to accelerate and amplify their exploitation of gold in Sudan. And there was a big gold exploration concession awarded to a Russian company in April 2024 as part of that ambition and maximizing the logistics efficiency of being able to use the Port of Sudan and also use it for military purposes as well. So the Central African Republic, we've seen many of these similar dynamics, and it's quite surprising for people often to see, like, locals carrying Russian flags, etc., and signs that back in the themes that we mentioned along the information warfare sign track of operation. And, that has led to a really significant amplification of Russian involvement in mining ventures in the Central African Republic. And they've been able to gain very significant economic influence in the Central African Republic. And really the control over the governance regimes in that country has really been extensive now. So it's almost like a Russian imperial footprint across Central Africa these days, with how they've been able to exert their influence politically, economically, and militarily. I mentioned Libya. They've become an increasingly important hub in this mix. The oil industry in Libya was a particular focus. It becomes very attractive to Russia to be able to be very controlling and insinuate themselves into oil industries in Africa and the Middle East because of the capabilities that they have through Gazprom, and obviously they have vast oil resources themselves. This is a very quick access to a lot of liquid gold, and countries being dependent upon the technical capabilities of Gazprom to exploit the resources and to build and maintain the facilities needed to exploit them. And so that investment, through also the political influence, means regimes don't have to worry about sanctions or worry about anybody being interested in their human rights. If they're dealing with Russian companies, that's not going to be an issue. So the Libyan situation in relation to their oil industry and their port facilities and their position in the logistics chain, supply chain that Russia is building that extends into the rest of Central Africa became very important to them. So that, of course, becomes very complicated when you look at it in the context of the fighting that's gone on in Libya, and the fall of Gaddafi has not led to stability, and the Arab Spring really right across Africa and the Middle East did not lead to the birthing of a new world of democracy, and particularly the fighting in Libya continues, and the issues around its internal instability are challenging for the goals that Russia has. And from time to time, it's a question of whose side you take in all of this. And it's a complicated landscape because you also have attempts by Europe to try and bring stability, because they have a really big interest in trying to stop the massive people smuggling activities that spring from Libya across the Mediterranean to Europe. And so you've seen separate efforts by the UK, by France, by Germany, and then, of course, by Turkey even, who become very active in Libya, and Russia, of course. So, and the United States as well, remotely, and all working at most of the time at cross purposes. So this is where a unified approach from Europe would really help. But Russia has been very closely associated with the eastern Libyan dictator, Khalifa Haftar. And so backing that horse has not been overwhelmingly successful, but it's certainly given them probably an advantage over any other opportunities to create someone or a regime or a grouping that's going to be successful in stabilizing Libya. And so that has given Russia the opportunity to continue to work on setting up a naval base in Tobruk. So now that engagement in Libya really stems from about 2014, when it started ramping up under the new regime that Putin was building. And really it took place in three phases, and drawing heavily on the Russian playbook for embedding itself in and exploiting fragile states. So the first thing you do is cultivation. You seed potential proxies through a range of influence groups. You sow fertile ground for deeper interactions where Russia lacks pre-existing relations. And then through this Wagnerification, if you like, through the private military corporations, you start deploying Russian intelligence capabilities. And now the Wagner Group, following the elimination of Prigozhin and Dmitry Utkin, has fallen directly under the control of the GRU, military intelligence organization, which has a special branch dedicated to regime change and assassinations, etc. So it helps you then entrench yourself in a country by helping a proxy, usually a struggling strongman. And then you have the domestication phase, where you increasingly use open control over that proxy and the country's assets to advance Russian interests, often to the severe detriment of the country itself and its people. So those are really the phases of their approach to this. I mentioned the information operations in Libya is a really good case study of how they build this up. So their disinformation campaign in Libya to dominate the country's already poorly regulated and managed information space was through the mimicking of methods that were developed at the Internet Research Agency Prigozhin established in St. Petersburg. So Facebook was the primary communication platform for that. For over 2/3 of Libyans who use it, that was really your go-to mechanism. And from December 2018, the Wagner Group created a network of interlinked news sites, and Social First was one of those in the Facebook pages, focused on memes and live videos. And the pages were run by administrators in Egypt and managed by Russian-trained reporters alongside Libyan subcontractors. And that really complicated the task for Libyan authorities and international investigators to track which pages featured Russian involvement. And so Wagner's use of Libyan consultants also allowed it to pick up and sensationalize local grievances to polarize audiences and create an impassioned follower base who could then be conditioned into adopting Russian-devised narratives. So this Facebook trialed content then branched out to other social media platforms along with private WhatsApp and Telegram groups, and these activities then got grouped into an impression that they were promoting the widely supported manufacturing highly impactful echo chambers. And so, this gives you the amplification of your information warfare themes. So they had a lot of savvy social media engagement tactics like competitions, feedback forms, Facebook live videos, and developed close relationships with their audience that way. So this network of different organizations hosting these pages illustrated how useful the decentralized system of ad hoc companies was for really facilitating these Wagner activities, but disguising them as well and making it hard for intelligence and investigators to penetrate it. Leaked documents, though, did expose what was going on there in terms of these operations, and Facebook uncovered similar networks in Central African Republic, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Madagascar, Mozambique, and Sudan. So you can see this case study of Libyan information operation was one that has been applied across that Central African world that Russia is particularly focused on in Africa. All right, well, I think that's a good introduction to this story of how Russia operates in Africa and the Middle East and what we're confronting globally. And we'll come back to delve further into this at our next session. And thank you for being with me this week. Cheers.